Imagine being locked in a cell, not just awaiting execution, but being tortured by the very people meant to guard you. That's exactly what infamous serial killer Aileen Wuornos claimed in the days leading up to her death. But what really happened behind those prison walls?
I suffered so bad. I was really struggling to survive. Hey, I was tortured at BCI.
Before we uncover the chilling details of Wuornos' time in prison, let's rewind to where her story begins. A journey so brutal and chaotic, it's no surprise she became known as one of the most dangerous women in history. Aileen Wuornos wasn't just born into chaos, she was swallowed by it. By the time she was a teenager, she was surviving through prostitution on the streets of Florida, desperate and spiraling. But no one could have predicted what came next. Her first murder, the one that put her on the map. In late November 1989, Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner, picked up Wuornos while she worked as a prostitute. They ended up in his car, heading into the secluded Florida woods. Wuornos claimed Mallory violently attacked her, and in a panic, she shot him dead. But her actions were far from self-defense. She fired several times, ensuring he wouldn't survive. His body was left abandoned in the woods, and she fled with his car. That murder was just the beginning. Over the next year, 6 more men would die at her hands. When Wuornos was finally arrested and sentenced to death, many thought her story ended there, but it didn't. According to Aileen, what happened to her inside prison was worse than anything she ever did on the outside. Wuornos began making bone-chilling accusations. She claimed the prison guards were tormenting her, tampering with her food and trying to crush her spirit. She said they were torturing her in ways no one could see, pushing her closer and closer to madness. And it wasn't just talk. Her behavior became more erratic, more paranoid with every passing day. Was this the unraveling of a guilty mind, or was something far more terrifying happening behind those bars? As her execution date loomed, Aileen's accusations grew louder. She insisted that the guards were manipulating her, driving her insane on purpose. She even hinted at dark conspiracies, claiming that the system was out to destroy her mind before her body. It was as if death row wasn't enough for them. They wanted her to suffer, to break. And break she did. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection, but her final words were anything but ordinary. Before they silenced her forever, she made a chilling declaration.
They're trying to make it look like I was crazy at all times, rig up the room with torture. If I said anything about I think their whole plan was trying to make it look like I was totally crazy. And so nobody would believe anything I had to say about anything.
Was this just the delusional rant of a woman driven mad by her own guilt? Or was it a warning, a final, eerie glimpse into the horrors she claimed to have endured in her final days? Whatever the truth, Aileen Wuornos didn't just die by lethal injection. She was slowly and methodically destroyed from the inside out. Genene Jones. In the world of serial killers, there's a particular kind of darkness reserved for those who prey on the most innocent. Children. And no one embodies that horror more than Genene Jones, a pediatric nurse who turned hospitals into her personal hunting grounds. But Jones's story doesn't just stop at the horror she unleashed on her young victims. It spirals into a twisted tale of near-death experiences behind bars, conspiracies, and a prison life where karma came knocking harder than anyone could have predicted. Genene Jones was supposed to be a healer, entrusted with saving lives. But for over a decade, Jones turned her job into a killing spree, targeting babies and toddlers. She injected them with lethal doses of drugs like succinylcholine and digoxin, watching as doctors frantically tried to save the children while they slipped away, often right in front of their desperate parents. She didn't stop until at least 60 children were dead, though some believe the real number could be even higher. One of the most shocking cases was that of Chelsea McClellan, a 15-month-old girl brought in for routine treatment. Chelsea's mother had no idea that the nurse smiling at her, offering comfort, was about to plunge a needle filled with a paralytic drug into her daughter's tiny body. Within minutes, Chelsea was in cardiac arrest, and despite desperate efforts to revive her, she died in her mother's arms. And Jones? She stood there, calm, as if it was just another day at work. Her reign of terror came to an end in 1983 when her suspicious pattern of deaths caught up with her. Convicted for the murder of Chelsea McClellan and the attempted murder of another child, Jones was sentenced to 99 years in prison. But this is where the nightmare followed her behind bars. Jones thought she could hide from society's justice within the cold, grey walls of a prison, but what she couldn't escape was the seething hatred of her fellow inmates. In the hierarchy of prison, there's nothing worse than harming children. It makes you a target, a walking death sentence. Just 2 years into her sentence, that hatred turned into action. Inmates cornered Jones in the showers, armed with makeshift knives. The plan was clear: make her pay for every child she had taken from this world. Jones barely survived. Prison guards arrived just in time to pull her from the bloody mess, but the message was clear: she was living on borrowed time. Placed in solitary confinement for her own protection, Jones still lived in constant fear. Whispers of paid-off inmates circulated. Every sound startled her. Every day she stayed alive in that prison was a gamble. Though she wasn't killed in prison, Janine Jones came closer than most would dare to imagine. The scars weren't just physical, they were etched into her psyche, a reminder that even behind bars, karma has a way of catching up to you. Dorothea Puente. Dorothea Puente, a name that at first glance might seem almost grandmotherly, but beneath that sweet old lady facade was a woman capable of chilling horrors, and even after her arrest, the world couldn't fully comprehend how someone so seemingly innocent could hide such darkness. But here's the real twist. Even in prison, Puente faced justice in the most unexpected and brutal way possible. Before we get to that, let's pull back the curtain on her gruesome story. In the 1980s, Dorothea ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, catering to elderly tenants, often people society had forgotten. She presented herself as their savior, offering food, shelter, and care. But Puente saw her tenants as paychecks, collecting their social security checks while drugging, killing, and burying their bodies in her backyard. One of her victims was Alvaro Bert Montoya, a mentally disabled tenant who trusted her completely. But Puente saw Bert as just another check, someone she could easily dispose of. When police finally caught up to her, they found 7 bodies buried in her yard, a grotesque garden of death hidden beneath her carefully tended flowers. After her arrest, Puente ended up behind bars, but life in prison was no safer than the streets she once terrorized. Prison operates on a brutal code of honor, and harming the elderly makes you a prime target. Despite her age, Puente quickly became a target in prison, not just for her crimes, but for how she manipulated and deceived so many. Inmates, disgusted by her crimes, eventually took justice into their own hands. They cornered Puente and brutally attacked her, leaving her barely clinging to life. Guards found her bloodied and gasping for breath, but the message was clear. She wasn't going to live her remaining years peacefully in prison. Though she escaped the death penalty in the courtroom, the prison walls became a cage of terror. Dorothea Puente spent her final years constantly looking over her shoulder, trapped in a hell of her own making. Karla Homolka. Karla Homolka. Her name alone sends chills down the spine. Alongside her partner, Paul Bernardo, she committed some of the most heinous crimes in Canadian history. But what happened when justice finally caught up with her? And was she truly safe, even behind bars? Karla Homolka played a key role in the sexual assaults and murders of multiple young girls, including her own sister, Tammy Homolka, a crime so disturbing it still leaves people speechless. But Karla managed to secure a plea deal, convincing authorities that she was forced into these atrocities by her abusive husband. And the courts bought it. She was sentenced to just 12 years in prison. But prison wasn't about to let her off so easily. In prison, there's an unspoken hierarchy, and those who harm children are at the very bottom. Karla's involvement in her sister's death and other horrific acts made her a prime target. Her time in prison quickly became a nightmare. She was harassed daily, and physical attacks were not uncommon. One particularly vicious attack nearly ended her life. Inmates cornered Karla in her cell, launching a brutal beating. By the time guards arrived, she was bloodied and barely conscious. It was a clear message. Karla might have escaped true justice in court, but she wouldn't escape it in prison. Despite surviving her sentence, Karla left prison with permanent scars, both physical and psychological. Though she attempted to start a new life after her release, the world has not forgotten her crimes, and likely never will. Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood. Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood, known as the Lethal Lovers, their story is one of manipulation, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder. Together, they killed at least 5 elderly women in a twisted game of love and control. But what happened when these 2 women were finally separated and locked behind bars? Did prison hold any safety for such cold-hearted killers, or did their horrors follow them straight to their cells? Gwendolyn Graham was the dominant force in their relationship, killing the elderly residents of a Michigan nursing home, while Kathy acted as the lookout. Their bond was sealed with the lives they took, but it all came crashing down when Kathy betrayed Gwendolyn to save herself. Sentenced to life without parole, Gwendolyn entered prison facing a grim reality. Those who prey on the weak and defenseless don't last long behind bars. She was constantly threatened, attacked, and tormented by other inmates. The woman who once controlled life and death found herself powerless in a world where she was the target. Meanwhile, Kathy Wood, having struck a plea deal, served her time in a less severe prison, but her manipulative nature didn't fade. She navigated the prison system with the same cunning that led to murder, though she too lived in constant fear of retribution. For both women, prison was no escape from justice. It was the beginning of a slow, torturous descent into their own personal hells.